Christmas Eve. Snow had stopped falling long enough for the city to collect itself into a hush, and the office windows were black mirrors all the way down to the river. I was sitting across from Robert at his mahogany desk, the leather of the chair pressed into the curve of my knees. He slid a personnel form toward me with a practiced motion, one I'd seen him use for years when he wanted to make an ordinary thing feel like an event. "Say sorry," he said. "No preamble, no softening. Apologize to Victoria publicly, or I'll place you on suspension and postpone the promotion. No pay until we decide." The form was crisp, the typewriter straight letters listing options: suspension, salary adjustment, deferred promotion. The room smelled faintly of his aftershave and the varnish of the desk. Outside, a taxi hissed away from the curb. It felt like someone had removed a structural beam from the building of my life, and the whole thing might lean, then fall. I looked at the paper. I looked at his face. He was the kind of man who could reduce a person to a checkbox and call it leadership. We had built a company together. We had stayed up until dawn over grant applications and clinical timelines, argued about endpoints in ethics and the slowness of science, the way married people argue about the economy of a family budget. He had been my partner. I had watched the company become his stage. "You want me to apologize," I said. The words were soft but steady. "To your lover. To the woman you put in charge of innovation and then asked me to step over when her numbers didn't add up." He tapped the edge of the form with a manicured finger. "It's simple. Public apology to Victoria at the company party tonight. Pay cut. Promotion postponed. If you want to keep anything, that's the price." I let the silence lengthen just long enough to register in his chest. He had always mistaken silence for weakness. He had never liked being ignored. "Okay," I said. Not because I agreed. Okay was not capitulation. It was a hinge. If you believe no one should weaponize their power, stay with me and subscribe. How did we get here? The trajectory looks dramatic on paper. 2 people in a lab, a fledgling biotech, a NASDAQ ticker, op-eds praising our mission. It was simpler in reality, and therefore stranger. I met Robert in the 3rd year of my PhD. He was a visiting fellow with a way of talking about risk that made you believe business plans could be equations. We argued about endpoints in clinical trials over coffee, and then argued about paint colors for the tiny startup office we rented above a bakery. I had the maps and the assays. He had the pitch and the bravado. For a while, the compliment felt inevitable. We incorporated Morrison Pharmaceuticals in a borrowed conference room, scribbling on a whiteboard. Focus on rare neuromuscular disorders, patient-first pipelines, transparent data. I wrote the scientific rationale. He schmoozed the angels. People liked the narrative of 2 young founders who cared more about patients than profit. I liked that people believed it. I liked the cadence of creating things that mattered. There were early victories. The first small grant that meant we paid rent for 1 less month. The first compassionate use case we supported and watched a child breathe easier. Those moments were what we had put our names on. They were why I kept my head in the lab even as the company's press releases mounted. They were why, when the investors wanted faster returns and cleaner sound bites, I pushed back. Science doesn't respect speed. Patients deserve rigor. Robert began to change slowly. The first signs were subtle. Longer dinners with investors, a new wardrobe, a willingness to let marketing adjust phrasing on our scientific communications to make headlines. He told me he was optimizing for scale. He started talking about positioning as you would brand a pivot. It sounded slippery against the bluntness of peptide chemistry and clinical endpoints. He smiled more in photos. Victoria came in like a fresh scrubbed consultant with a PhD from an Ivy and an appetite for disruption. She called herself a product visionary. She had the portfolio and the type of soft steel in her voice that made committees nod. I remember her hand, warm, quick, when she greeted me, and how she said, "I think there's untapped potential in aesthetics. Anti-aging is a huge market." I remember how my chest tightened then, the awkward clinical constriction that felt like a warning light on a diagnostic readout. Her proposal was pretty on the surface, a cosmetic line, repurposing some off-label mechanisms we had been studying for muscle regeneration. It would carry lower regulatory burden and faster market timelines, translate into revenue, into optics, into numbers that would please the quarterly analysts. Robert loved it. So did the marketing board. It was a classic lever. Present a seductive alternate revenue stream at the moment the company needed an image of growth, and everyone forgets to ask the hard questions. I asked the hard questions. I walked through the data with a scalpel. sample sizes that were too small, endpoints too subjective for the inference she wanted, and a plan that reused safety data in ways that complicated evidentiary narratives for the original rare disease programs. Victoria's charts were glossy, mine were annotated. In a meeting, I pointed out a critical flaw in her proposed assay that would make the cosmetic efficacy claims scientifically indefensible if regulators looked closely. The room had the uncomfortable rustle of a flock deciding which way to fly. People sleep on consequences when the immediate horizon is profitable. The board voted to table her program and proceed with the rare disease pipeline as planned. It was a small victory. It should have felt definitive. Instead, it lodged in the atmosphere like a small, sharp stone. That night, home felt different. We stopped saying we. We arranged our lives in separate compartments, his dinners, my data. He began taking late calls in the study. He would stand by the window, jaw tight, when a text arrived, a quick smile flickering in the dark, a laugh I wasn't invited to hear. I'd watched the way he looked at his phone and seen attention curl away from me, the way a tide slips from a shoreline. The affair was not cinematic. It was perversely corporate in its stealth. An overheard delivery notice, a calendar entry with an initial that wasn't mine, a photograph on his phone he thought he had deleted. I didn't confront him with fireworks. I cataloged the evidence, not because I intended to expose him, but because I am a scientist, and because facts are a kind of protection. Once you see the mechanical truth of something, what lever is being pulled, why the gears are grinding, you stop being completely surprised by its consequences. I documented his expense memos that improved Victoria's travel line items under innovation strategy. I saved emails where he softened language around product claims. I bookmarked regulatory filings that hinted at a cosmetic pivot. I did not leak or shout. I prepared. Then Victoria's proposal came back in a different suit. Less cosmetic sugar, more supposed synergy. She had dressed the data in confidence and rebranded risk as diversification. The fall board meeting is the kind of dance where people wear their ambivalence in their hands. I remember the rustle of papers, the glances, the polite applause when charts with nice projections unfurled. Her voice was practiced. She knew how to build momentum by reframing terms. Accelerated revenue, portfolio resilience, brand expansion. I began my dismantling the way I had been taught in grad school. Make the smallest, most precise incision to reveal the underlying problem. I walked through regulatory timelines, the potential for endpoint contamination, the ethics of diverting R&D dollars from orphan indications, and the long-term reputational hit for a company whose public story was patient first. I had a slide that showed median time to approval for our class of molecules versus a cosmetic pathway with realistic sensitivity analyses. I had clinical anecdotes, uncomfortable, precise, that connected to the human cost of delaying our core programs. The room grew quieter. Board members who had nodded for the glossy slides began to frown at the timelines. The senior investor who had once told Robert to think bigger leaned back and asked a logistical question about resource allocation. My language was technical but accessible. I remember choosing phrases without anger, because anger makes data look like opinion. I cited precedent, companies that had chased quick revenue and paid for it in clinical credibility. I spoke for patients at the margin, the ones without a lobby, the ones whose families called our office with hope in their voices.
When the vote came, it wasn't a landslide, but it was enough. The board sided with protecting the rare disease pipeline and asked for a rework of Victoria's proposal to ensure it wouldn't cannibalize core programs. It was a win that smelled like antiseptic. Robert did not smile at me. He did not look at me at all. He hid humiliation the way some people hide a bruise, with a smile that looked practiced and a series of small, cold gestures. He began to sharpen his edges in meetings, to make comments about my resistance to market realities, to imply that the lab was sentimental. He added a caveat to the investor calls about creative avenues we were exploring. Victoria reacted to the vote with a kind of polite surgical disappointment, as if her elaborate architecture of persuasion had been measured and found wanting. She sent me an email the day after, thanking the board for its considered critique and asking for a follow-up meeting to align metrics. She was strategic and not cruel. She simply wanted what she wanted. It was one thing to lose an argument about corporate priorities. It is another to be rendered surplus in the life you share with someone. The boundary between professional disagreement and personal betrayal blurred when the professional decision was used as leverage. Robert began to recalibrate his power in ways that were no longer about optics. He knew how to weaponize a personnel file. He learned the precise language in HR forms that let one person strip another of visibility and income without a rumor leaking in the press. He learned how to make formalities sound like inevitabilities. Then, in that long, slow slide, he made the ultimatum. When he slid the form across the desk that December evening, it felt less like a demand and more like an announcement that he had found a new axis from which to run the company, an axis oriented by his private alliances rather than our founding mission. The personnel form wasn't just a checkbox, it was his claim that the company could be redirected at his whim and that he could make personal entanglements into corporate instruments. The day after the ultimatum, I woke early and went to the office before anyone else. The building smelled of cold metal and lemon cleaner. I sat in my lab coat for a long time at my bench, tracing the edge of a data printout. My hands had always been calmer when holding a vial than when holding someone's gaze. The lab insisted on facts, on repeatable experiments. The human world did not. I told only a few people what was happening. Dr. James Morrison, our founder and chairman, was one. He had gray at his temples and a face that suggested he had loved and lost many things in his life, then loved again with the steadiness of someone who believed in second chances. He called me that morning and asked, "Do you want me to sit in?" I told him no. Sitting in wouldn't fix the lever. He said quietly, "Keep your options open."
He meant keep your credibility intact, keep your alternatives available. Jennifer Chin, in regulatory affairs, was another person I trusted. She understood the regulatory timelines and the potential pitfalls of a cosmetic pivot in a company whose public mission was to deliver life-changing, not life-enhancing therapies. She and I began cataloging potential vulnerabilities in a way that kept the company safe rather than seeking revenge. The difference was intentional. We framed our work as preservation of research integrity for patients, not personal retribution. It was around then that I began to consider the idea of mobility, not flight, but strategic relocation. The company had been expanding its footprint in Europe for years. Regulatory pathways there were complementary to our pipeline, and we had a small but growing research base in London. There was a vacancy for a managing director role, an opportunity that had been discussed internally when Dr. Morrison had been planning a more decentralized model. He liked the idea of boots-on-the-ground leadership in Europe. He liked the idea of putting someone who understood science in charge of the operation. He liked the idea of a presence that would ensure our rare disease programs did not get seconded to fast money fashion. If you build an alternative with integrity, funded, staffed, and properly documented, it becomes a lever you can use to protect the mission. If you bide your time and compile the right approvals, you can create an escape hatch that is also a platform. I started by opening the right files. What I did was procedural and deliberate. I asked Dr. Morrison for a conversation about global governance and suggested a formal motion to strengthen our European oversight. He liked that I framed it as stewardship rather than retreat. We drafted a proposal for a managing director role in London with clear responsibilities, budgets, and timelines. It was a sensible document. It outlined oversight mechanisms, reporting lines, staff plans, and a 5-year research strategy that complemented our orphan drug pipeline. Then we took the procedural steps. The board debated the motion. A version of it was approved in principle and filed in the corporate record as a strategic expansion. That filing was not the kind of thing that made headlines. It didn't need to. It simply existed in minutes and signatures and place in the organization chart. We left an audit trail, personnel nominations, budget allocations, resource requests. I saved copies to a secure folder that only a handful of people could access. I booked flights to London for a series of meetings that had legitimate purpose: site visits, contract negotiations, lab planning. Boarding passes are banal until you need one as proof you were already making a move independent of personal drama. I did not tell Robert. He would have turned any procedural motion into an argument about loyalty. He saw loyalty as allegiance to him, not to an idea.
Allowing him to know I was building a platform elsewhere would have fed his desire to make me choose between my dignity and my position. The point of building the London strategy quietly was to make visible to the world the reality that our company's mission did not hinge on his whims. There was moral clarity to it. The documentation we kept was not evidence to blackmail, it was insurance for the science. If the company pivoted away from our rare disease programs under the guise of innovation, we would have the structural basis to continue that work elsewhere within the company, legitimately, with budget and board approval. It's the difference between setting a legal trap and directing a lifeboat. I kept repeating that to myself because it kept the intent clean. Months passed in a blur of meetings and small, precise acts. I signed non-binding MOUs with a small research collective in King's Cross. I met with Marcus and Elena, 2 scientists who would eventually run the chemistry and translational units in London. I went to dinners and left early. I brought files home in my briefcase, and once accidentally tucked a boarding pass into a stack of lab notes, an unremarkable thing, except that it made my heart jump when I found it the next morning. I updated the proposal to reflect a realistic resource plan. I refined the scientific agenda to include a translational hub in Edinburgh that could accelerate small molecule candidates into phase 1. The work felt, in a way, like doing experiments on myself. Small manipulations, careful observations, repeating until results replicated. No one asked me to do this. No one insisted. I did it because when power tilts, you either lurch defenselessly or you construct a response that honors the people you serve, the patients, the researchers, the teams who have stayed with the work because they believed it mattered. The difference between public spectacle and quiet strategy is crucial. The former feeds gossip. The latter preserves value. I also made sure the motion was evident in the right places. Dr. Morrison signed a memorandum recommending a London managing director to the board and asked the corporate secretary to note the intent in the minutes. The corporate counsel filed a notice of intent with the investor relations team. Routine, unglamorous, something that reads in a year-end report like, Strategic International Expansion Approved. I saved snippets of email chains, calendars, and expense approvals in a secure folder that was not easily accessible by someone with deep access to Robert's accounts. Secrecy, in this case, was a structural choice, not a moral failing. There were human costs. The silence with Robert became a new kind of cruelty because it was full of things unsaid. I met with friends and colleagues who tried to cajole me into confrontation. They saw the injustice and wanted spectacle. I said no. The spectacle would have only offered him revenge in the form of headlines and control.
I wanted a different kind of clarity, a public demonstration that aligned with the company's stated mission and that would make it harder for him to reduce our work to a personal chess game. In the weeks leading to December, tensions ratcheted. Robert made small moves, reassigning staff lines, quietly reallocating meeting agendas, inserting new KPIs that favored superficial revenue gains. He positioned Victoria at the center of presentations to investors. Her smile in the slides looked like a calculated guarantee that she and he were steering the ship. And yet, in boardrooms and in emails and in the quiet of lab benches, I continued to build. I staged nothing flashy. I collected signatures. I had lunch with a London headhunter and asked a few discreet questions about market conditions. I engaged advisors about the regulatory pathways in the UK and EU. I spoke frankly with Jennifer about what resources we would need and how we would shepherd the rare disease portfolio through the transition. There was a moral architecture to every step. We framed each move as protecting patients, protecting the research, and preserving the company's long-term credibility. We did not stockpile personal ammunition. We built an institutional option. Christmas Eve arrived, and Robert's ultimatum slotted into the timeline like a machine part finally engaged. He believed his form would be the cog that would make the machinery of the company do his bidding. He believed that by making the threat public, by coercing me to apologize at the party, he would secure a narrative advantage, that his will bent the company and that dissent had social cost. When he slid the form in front of me and demanded the apology, I said simply, okay. It was a word that could have been an admission. It was not. It was the hinge I had been preparing for. That evening, when the party swelled and music filled the ballroom and colleagues drank to the end of a tough year, I stepped toward the microphone with a document in my pocket that most of the room hadn't seen. The personnel action form Robert had expected me to sign was no longer the only formal paper on his desk. There was a board-approved motion with a chain of signatures and a set of dates and budget lines. In my coat was a flight itinerary that proved I had been in London negotiating facility space and staff months earlier. These were not theatrical props. They were procedural truths. But that is a story for what comes next. For now, on Christmas Eve, with the world outside muffled by snow and the office lights warm and false, I stood in a room that had been our stage and felt the fulcrum shift. I was aware of the crowd gathering, the forked reflections of faces in the wine glasses, the way people's attention arranges itself around someone to see a performance. I felt the small, cold detail of the personnel form in my pocket and the slightly warmer weight of the board minutes tucked beside it. Robert expected a two-part script: shame, then dominance. He had learned to see personal leverage as corporate force. He had not, I discovered, accounted for the particular stubbornness of someone who had measured every variable and prepared contingencies, not out of spite, but out of duty. As the party lights haloed the chandelier and colleagues began to murmur about year-end and promotions, I made a decision that felt less like spectacle and more like an experiment reaching its critical moment. I smoothed my dress, felt the paper in my pocket, and walked toward a microphone whose cord felt like a lifeline. That night, I did not reach for vengeance. I reached for clarity. I did not speak to humiliate. I spoke to reveal an alternative that had been made legitimate inside the company's own governance. The words I would say were simple, true to the scientist in me and to the patient-first promise that had always been the pulse of our work.
The moment was about transforming a coerced apology into a demonstration of agency that would protect the research and the people who needed us. I remember the click of the microphone and the way the room leaned in. I remember Robert, in the crowd, the shadow he cut over a table, and the little flicker of belief on his face that this was his theater. I remember thinking, as I tightened my grip on the document in my pocket, that for once I would turn his instrument of coercion into the proof of something he could not easily undo. The story does not end at the microphone. It instead pivots. The move I made was not a single act of theatrical defiance, but the culmination of months of careful, bureaucratic engineering designed to preserve the work. That was the point, to make sure the company's mission had options that were legitimate, board-approved, and anchored in scientific stewardship. When the night resolved into a dozen different small consequences, some immediate, some delayed, people would call it a resignation, a public confrontation, a strategic relocation, or a scandal. None of those labels captured the real sequence of actions: careful documentation, board motions, meetings in London, and a refusal to be reduced to a checkbox on someone else's power play. And yet, there was more to come. The move I set in motion would ripple across committees and meeting minutes, past investor calls and lab benches. Some people would cheer, others would call it abandonment. Some would have been surprised at my sang-froid. They misunderstood the quiet calculus of contingency. On the walk back from the podium, as the orchestra changed tempo and someone bought a bottle of champagne, I slid the personnel form from my pocket and placed it into an envelope. I slid the board motion in too. I left them where the company's own processes could find them. I did what I had intended. I made visible a structured alternative to the narrative Robert tried to enforce. Outside, the snow had thickened.
The city had gone on with its lights. I closed my eyes and felt, for a moment, like someone who had completed a long experiment and was stepping back to see if the data supported the hypothesis. It did. The hypothesis was not about revenge, but about preservation. It was about making sure that the work we had started would not be diverted to whispered priorities that favored profit over purpose. I had planned for months, moved with the patience, and the small acts of procedural discipline had set the stage. But plans, even the best designed, are not revelations until they are enacted publicly. The rest, consequences, investigations, resignations, would unfold in their own rhythms. For now, the immediate choice had been made. The microphone had been used to announce an intention that was already, quietly, in motion. I left the party and walked into a night that smelled of wet coal and possibility. I had not known at that point how many colleagues would support the motion or how fierce the countercurrents would be. I did not yet know the precise path the company would take in the months that followed or the personal toll each decision would exact. I only knew I had arranged my life so that when the lever came down, I could respond in a way that honored our patience. The word okay had shifted under my hands from acquiescence to agency. I had said it in the mahogany office because it gave me a moment's room to choose. I had used the room on Christmas Eve to enact that choice in public. What happened next was not a spectacle I sought to stage. It was a set of consequences that measured themselves against the documentation and the minutes we had filed. Men who use power like a scalpel are often surprised when the scalpel is turned toward better uses of authority. They are surprised when the rules they thought would shield their control instead become instruments of accountability. And there, under the cold city lights, I felt the first long, slow arc of liberation begin, built not from vindictiveness, but from the same patient rigor that had guided our pipelines. I had taken a stand that night, but the work of defending that stand, of translating it into real, measurable protections for patients and researchers, had only just begun. The morning after the party arrived in small, granular ways, a series of terse emails, the echo of a hangover at the office from someone else's end-of-year revelry, a line in the Investor Relations Digest that read like a breadcrumb: strategic international expansion progressing. There was no dramatic headline on my desk yet, no immediate vortex of accusatory phone calls. The world outside its small orbit went on conducting itself with the polite indifference of markets and weather. Inside the company, however, things moved with the precision of people adjusting to a new set of possibilities.
The envelope I had left on Robert's desk, the personnel action form and the board motion, was found not by him but by the corporate secretary, an efficient woman who preferred her work to be invisible. She did what procedure demanded.
She scanned and logged the materials in the same dry way she logged all motions that crossed her desk. The board committee that handled governance convened the next morning. Minutes were read, votes were tallied. I did not expect fireworks. I expected bureaucracy to do what bureaucracy does. It clarifies, it reformulates, it makes decisions in a language that can be audited. That was my point. I had been deliberately boring in what I filed. I had deliberately rendered contingency into procedures. If someone wanted to convert personal leverage into corporate force, the antidote was institutional clarity. Still, institutional clarity sometimes leads to uncomfortable questions. The governance committee asked for a review, not of me, but of the circumstances surrounding the last few months of financial allocations, travel expenses, and rapid hiring. That phrasing was careful. The subtext was obvious to everyone who had spent enough time in these rooms. When personal relationships intersected with lines on a ledger, transparency becomes a hard but necessary light. An independent audit firm was engaged. They did what auditors do. They requested records, cross-referenced, looked for patterns that suggested unusual approvals or expedited procurement. They were patient and unsentimental. They found patterns: overlapping expense timelines that favored certain travel providers, unusually rapid approval of vendor contracts that benefited a small consultancy linked professionally to someone in the executive suite, and a set of invoices that were tagged as innovation strategy and routed through a few optimistic memos. The auditors described these as irregularities requiring further review. The choice of words was unoffensive on the surface and devastating in practice. I cooperated. I turned over files I had kept, emails I had flagged for clarification, calendar entries showing my travel to London. I answered questions with the same methodical clarity I brought to a lab notebook. At one point, an investigator who was rough at the edges and precise in his reading of facts asked, "Did you ever seek to weaponize governance for personal reasons?" I thought about the months of carefully framed memos and how often I had repeated the phrase, "protect patients." I answered, "No. I sought to create a legitimate avenue for the research to continue if leadership priorities shifted." The auditor's work leaked, as such things do. A brief item appeared on a business newswire. Morrison Pharmaceuticals faces governance review amid leadership shifts. Reporters are always better at framing questions than answering them. Their headlines turn phrases into narratives.
Robert, who had always been adept at controlling narratives when they served him, found the machinery of narrative had a mind of its own. He spoke to the press with his practiced charm and offered measured assurances about strategic clarity and continuity. He also began to retreat from the front lines, canceled investor dinners, fewer op-eds, a sudden interest in the company's charitable arm. Victoria did not perform theatrics. She left the company a month later in a statement that praised Morrison's mission and wished the teams well. Her exit letter was professional and carefully drafted, an exercise in minimizing collateral damage. She took with her the kind of things ambitious leaders often take: a portfolio she could put on her resume and a set of contacts. People in the industry would later say she had simply moved on to greener pastures. Others would say she had been a useful foil in a larger internal contest. I did not need to interpret motives for everyone. I minded my own motive, to ensure the research continued. Robert's own position unraveled not because of a single scandal, but because the sustained weight of choices eventually becomes visible. The audits fed into a governance committee report that described the possibility of conflicts of interest and approval anomalies, phrases that are less incendiary than the tabloids cry, but more significant within the quiet corridors of a boardroom. The board demanded an explanation. Legal counsel recommended a pause in Robert's executive activities pending a full review. He did not step down immediately. Instead, he resisted, then negotiated, then finally accepted a leave of absence when a major investor made continued funding contingent on a leadership change. People like Robert are practiced at retaining the trappings of control while losing their hand on the wheel. The company posted a press release noting executive restructuring and a refocus on patient-first pipelines. Dr. Patricia Hammond, a senior board member with a reputation for steady operational leadership, was named interim CEO of the headquarters. Her appointment was framed as a stabilizing move meant to reassure regulators and investors. The language was careful. The intended effect was obvious: to separate personal drama from the company's scientific mission. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way movies imagine corporate collapses. They were granular, bureaucratic, and sometimes corrosive. There were depositions and requests for documentation, a handful of resignations from executives who did not want to be tethered to the ship while its course was questioned, and a flurry of investor Q&As that required precise talk about timelines and safeguards. There were also moments of surprising clarity, board members who remembered the company's founding pitch and who asked for renewed commitment to the rare disease portfolio. It was less a purge than a realignment, and the realignment itself created space.
I did not return to the mahogany desk often. Robert and I had by then settled into the practical distance that follows a rupture. Separate bedrooms, separate calendars, the small civility of two lives continuing under the same roof, because untying them required legal threads we did not yet wish to tug. The company, however, was far less about our private disentangling and more about the teams. Jennifer Chin worked at the regulatory elbow of the rare disease programs. She shepherded submissions and liaised with European regulators, who had been receptive to our translational hub proposal. Marcus and Elena in London marshaled their scarcest resource, time, into careful assay development. Mark and David negotiated facility leases and crafted hiring plans that favored experienced translational scientists and ethicists. We kept our focus narrow. The work in London continued under the governance structure we had put in place, a managing director role with clear reporting lines and a budget that had been approved and filed. It was boring and therefore effective. We filed the expansion in the public registries as required, noting the intended purpose, to expand translational capacity and strengthen oversight of core clinical programs. The language was neutral. The effect was to formalize an alternative locus of control within the company that would not be trivial for a single person to dismantle. When Dr. James Morrison died, sudden, with the odd soft finality that a heart attack can have, I was somewhere between a lab bench and a transit lounge, on my way to negotiate a supplier contract in Scotland. The call came as a clipped voice in my ear, and the rest of the world contracted around the sound of someone saying his name without the warmth that always accompanied it. I felt the rawness of grief and an odd, immediate clarity about the fragility of the work we had all tried to protect. His funeral was a small, beautiful thing. He had built his life around certain kinds of steadiness, an insistence that mission matters more than personal gain, and an affection for incremental progress. People spoke about his willingness to sit with uncomfortable ethical questions and his belief in institutions as vessels for long-term good. In his study, there was a pile of correspondence, notes from patients' families, letters from volunteers at clinical sites, a stack of annotated science papers. He was, in the end, more remarkable for his ordinary constancy than for any flamboyant gesture. A few days after the funeral, the corporate council called me into a small conference room. There was a thin envelope on the polished table. Inside was a letter in Dr. Morrison's hand. He wrote with the kind of directness that makes sentences both brittle and honest. He thanked me for my decades of work. He asked me to continue the European expansion with the seriousness it deserved, and he documented, in legal terms and with the counsel of corporate lawyers, an offer. He wanted me to consider taking up a leadership role in the wider organization, and he had arranged for a transfer of voting shares and an offer of CEO consideration should I wish it. The phrase that landed in me more than any other was not the legalese. It was the single line he appended at the end, unsentimental and human. If you wish to lead, take my hand. If you wish instead to lead quietly where the work is done, know I trust you to choose. There were, of course, board processes attached to the letter, formal notifications, votes, stock transfer paperwork, and filings. Dr. Morrison had been methodical to the end. He had used his authority and his trust to make sure that whoever took the reins of the company would remain beholden to the work. The offer of 40% voting shares, intended to be a bulwark against the whims of short-termism, was not a command. It was a trust investment into the idea that someone would steward the mission beyond their personal life. The board convened to consider the letter and the offers embedded within it. There were people who believed I should take the CEO role, others who thought my strengths were strategic and operationally placed, not performative. They asked me questions about temperament and goals. What did I want? Did I seek the center stage? Did I want to make headlines and man the microphones? Did I want to steward the home office in the way Dr. Morrison had often done, with patience and restraint? I had thought about this question, not as a performative exercise, but as a scientific one. What result did I most want to observe? Did I want to change the variables at the center of the company and attempt to rewire leadership culture from the top down? Or did I want to consolidate an alternative locus of authority in London and show empirically that the mission could thrive outside the headlines in the careful choreography of experiments and regulatory submissions? In the end, I declined the CEO offer. It surprised a few people. It surprised my mail carrier and, for a moment, myself. Dr. Morrison's letter had allowed me the rare chance to choose, not from scarcity, but from abundance. I could take the biggest seat in the room, or I could continue building a unit that proved the company's purpose by the unspectacular labor of science. I chose the latter.
The board understood eventually. They appointed Dr. Patricia Hammond as permanent CEO at headquarters, someone who had the skill and steadiness to manage the investor relations and to smooth governance structures. They ratified the London managing director slot with extra oversight and a periodic reporting cadence that made the work visible and accountable.
They recognized that leadership comes in many forms. For those who wanted spectacle, the headquarters might offer more theater. For those who imagined quiet, rigorous progress, London would be the proving ground. At first, there were whispers about my decision. People who equate success with titles told me I had renounced hour. People who knew the science smiled, as if they had been proven right about what mattered. The truth was more nuanced. Declining the CEO role was not a renunciation, but an alignment. I had wanted the ability to move quickly, to shepherd translational science with fewer of the corporate distractions that often make labs into bureaucratic waiting rooms. I wanted to protect patients by keeping experiment timelines honest and by resisting the temptation to shift resources for PR wins. London proved to be less metropolitan glam and more practical challenge. Leases had to be negotiated, staffing plans implemented, and equipment ordered. I designed hiring protocols that favored people with experience in orphan drug development and gave priority to those who had lived through the chaos of clinical programs derailed by sudden pivots. Marcus and Elena assembled a small, fierce team, people who liked the work and disliked publicity. Mark and David turned an old warehouse into a lab wing suitable for our early translational steps. We were conscious of optics, but stubbornly focused on assay reproducibility and clear go-no-go milestones. Months of labor, meta-studies, preclinical validation, incremental optimizations started to yield an outcome that mattered not for headlines, but for a handful of families. A candidate compound we had been advancing for a particular neuromuscular target showed improved translational biomarkers in our Edinburgh hub. The data was not miraculous. It was the kind of measured, incremental success that made grant reviewers sigh with relief and clinicians lean in. It was the sort of finding that, if replicated in Phase 1, could justify an accelerated but rigorous clinical plan. I remember sitting in a small meeting room with Marcus and Elena when we saw the replication curves for the third time. The room smelled faintly of coffee and ethanol. We all looked at the line graphs like tired parents watching a child take a step. It was an ordinary kind of joy, the kind that follows a long test with a yes. We did not publish a triumphant press release that afternoon. We wrote a measured internal memo, planned a multi-center preclinical validation, and set up a timeline for regulatory engagement with the UK authorities. The patients' families who had been following our work received personal updates from the clinical liaison, and a small private gratitude arrived in handwritten notes and careful conversations. Success in science does not dissolve sorrow. I still carried the ache of what had been lost in my marriage, and the quiet knowledge that any professional success does not perfectly stitch the heart.
But the work brought a different kind of repair. I watched junior scientists find their stride within a team that cared about evidence. I mentored a woman who reminded me of my younger self, sharp, impatient with nonsense, and idealistic in her insistence that patients matter more than promotions. We balanced budgets and designed protocols. We turned in reports and defended our statistical assumptions without flourish. Months turned into a couple of years. The London team published a careful paper on translational biomarkers. We launched a Phase 1 protocol with patient safety as the cornerstone. The press, less interested in melodrama now that the headlines had moved on, noticed the technical achievement and framed it in the way science often is framed, as the patient, iterative work of skilled patient people. Robert's life after the board reconfiguration was quieter, and for a while, private. He left the company formally under terms that shielded both him and the site from protracted litigation. He later remarried, publicly at least, and settled into other ventures. People who study power know that some people remake themselves in different shapes, others calcify and struggle. I do not belabor his arc here. It was not my work to punish or to publicly prescribe the shape of his life. The work I set out to do was to make sure the science had options that were institutional, not personal. Victoria moved on as well. Later, briefly, we crossed professional paths at a conference where we both presented. We did not exchange more than a polite handshake. There are ways that people are both actors and victims of systems. She had been ambitious and talented. She had also been, from all I saw, a person who rose and adapted. I wished her professionalism and moved on. Then came the odd, small vindications that do not belong to me alone. The patients whose lives edged toward possibility because a trial remained funded. The lab technicians who found careers where they could be proud of what they built.
The families who no longer had to listen to funders suggest cosmetic pivot as the only path. Vindication in its best form is not fireworks. It is quiet, cumulative, and made public through the improved outcomes of people you are trying to help. There were, of course, moments of moral reckoning. Some board members who had supported early pivots were forced to explain their choices. There were tough conversations about how investor pressures had clouded judgment. We established a stewardship committee to ensure greater patient representation in strategic discussions. We wrote new governance principles emphasizing transparency in expense approvals and conflict of interest declarations. These are not glamorous accomplishments. They are forms of institutional repair.
One evening, years after the Christmas Eve ultimatum, I sat in a small seminar room in London and listened to a family whose child had been enrolled in an early phase study describe the impact of our continued commitment. They spoke without political flourish, simply about the relief of a family treated with respect, the clarity of information offered to them, and the sense that the clinicians had not been pushed by marketing priorities. I thought then, as I had in the beginning, about why we do science, not for headlines, but for thin human mercies. I do not claim everything that followed was tidy. People carry complicated feelings, and institutions seldom tidy themselves in a single season. The company rebuilt in phases, and there were legal settlements that mopped up practical difficulties, the kind of bureaucratic housekeeping that comes at the end of internal conflict. There were colleagues who left and those who stayed. There were moments when the temptation to seek personal closure through public spectacle hovered at the edge of choices that remain to this day human and frail. What I do claim is that the design I chose, quiet, procedural, boring, worked in the particular way I had hoped it would. It preserved options for the science. It gave a team a place to pursue translational work, and it made a public point that leadership is not always about occupying the highest chair. Some people asked me later whether the choice to decline a CEO role felt like cowardice or bravery. The answer, I think, reveals more about the myths of power than about me. Choosing a title is not the same thing as choosing responsibility. One can be a CEO and avoid the work that matters. One can be a director and carry a moral workload heavy enough to shape an entire therapeutic field. I refused the spotlight because my hypothesis, my experiment, was that a mission can be defended by constructing legitimate, durable alternatives. The data after 5 years suggested I was right. The word okay that night in the mahogany office had been the hinge. It had been a moment that bought me a breath, which I used to choose. I could have said no with a smaller drama, or yes to a humiliation designed to signal to shareholders who had the power. I said okay because I needed a decision time that would let me do the necessary work. The word's meaning changed from acquiescence to a deliberate, quiet agency. If there is a temptation in stories like this, it is to dazzle with revenge. I will not oblige that hunger. My satisfaction has been less a revenge arc than an accumulation of repairs. The company, wounded but not destroyed, returned to patient-centered priorities. The London team advanced a translational program that, in time, helped inform later phase trials. We hired ethicists. We improved expense approvals. We rewrote governance language that made it harder for personal relationships to be conflated with corporate directives.
There was, of course, a personal dimension to the recovery. I reconstituted my life with a slower rhythm. I learned to attend family dinners without measuring them against the company's calendar. I found small pleasures in walks around Hampstead Heath and the ritual of brewing strong tea after long days. I taught younger scientists how to write a convincing statistical plan. I took care to remain accessible, because part of my reading of leadership was that it only mattered if it produced people who could do better work and live with integrity. Dr. Morrison's letter remained in a drawer for a long time. I returned to it on restless nights. I read it not as a clumsy transfer of authority, but as a reminder that people can use their last acts to bind a future to a set of values. I thought often of his steady hands and the patient way he listened in meetings, and I tried to practice that kind of leadership in my own small decisions. When colleagues asked me if I had regretted not taking the CEO mantle, I would say, no, I wanted to see whether a mission could be defended by constructing an alternative locus of governance. Most people nodded, though I think many of them wanted a soundbite. If they wanted a soundbite, it would be this: there is a kind of power in making a place where the work can continue, even if personalities shift. That is not glamorous. It is necessary. The moral, if there is one that will fit on a postcard, is this: agency sometimes looks like walking away. Not walking away into anonymity or petty retaliation, but walking away into a deliberate space where you can rebuild what you care about under conditions you control. Okay is not a surrender when it is used to buy time for that choice.
Years later, at a scientific symposium in Edinburgh, I listened as clinicians described the way our translational biomarkers had helped stratify patient populations for early trials. The vocabulary was dry and technical: sensitivity analysis, endpoint selection, cohort enrichment, but the subtext was human: fewer patients exposed to futile trials, clearer pathways for those who might benefit. After the panel, someone walked up, a clinician whose niece had been in our earlier compassionate use case. She took my hand and said plainly, "Thank you. You kept the work going." Her words were not flamboyant. They landed like ballast. People will ask, of course, whether I had any satisfaction in the way the internal dynamics had played out. I will say only that satisfaction is not the same thing as triumph. I felt a deep, modest contentment in seeing that the structures I had put in place mattered. I felt relief that the research had not been repurposed as an easy revenue vehicle. I felt sorrow for the ways personal relationships can warp professional responsibilities. But most of all, I felt a durable confidence in the work.
If you are listening and you feel cornered in your own life by someone who thinks power is a club, remember that the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is construct an alternative with integrity. It will not necessarily be quick. It will likely be boring in the moment. It will require you to keep meticulous records, to ask for votes and minutes and signatures, to make sure the structures you build can outlast any one person's caprice. It is, in many ways, the same craft that makes good science: patient, disciplined, and devoted to truth. There are people who will interpret my story as vindication, others as prudence. I accept both. The point I keep returning to is the same one Dr. Morrison taught me: value, real patient-first value, deserves protection. Sometimes that protection is loud. Most times it is not. So when I think of that mahogany desk and the personnel form and the coldness of Robert's ultimatum, I no longer hear a demand. I hear a hinge. And when I say the word okay, I remember that it is not always a stop. Sometimes it is a conditional opening to a different, better experiment. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever been asked to choose between your dignity and someone else's leverage, subscribe for more stories about resilience and reclaiming agency. Tell me in the comments which moment in this story felt most true to you.